Welcome everybody to my Dungeon Dive series, where I break down many of the dungeons throughout the Zelda franchise, where I'll go through the good, the bad, and then determine just how well it stacks up against the others. Make sure to stay till the end to see where I rank the dungeon, and today we are diving into the Arbiter's Grounds from Twilight Princess. Cue the intro. Now, in order to determine what makes a good dungeon, we need to come up with some sort of objective way that we can score the dungeons. So I selected 4 main categories that I truly believe make a great dungeon. Now, the categories we're working with are dungeon atmosphere, puzzles, enemies, and the last one being the dungeon's fun factor. Now, each of these categories will be given a score from 1 to 10, and the cumulative score will be what determines the placing on the tier list. And finally, with all the logistics out of the way, let's dive into the Arbiter's Grounds.
The Gerudo Desert once held a prison built to hold the worst criminals this land has ever known. Now that prison is condemned, and it still holds the curse mirror and the malice of the doomed inmates.
Wow, this kind of world building allows the player to build a mental visual in their head of what exactly they're about to get into as they go into this next dungeon. Next, we get a wide sweeping shot of the desert that lay before us, along with Midna giving us a bit more background on her people, before panning up to see her final destination, the Arbiter's Grounds. Now, what you experience next is really what I can only describe as a true adventure. I mean, you make your way through the desert, sniping enemies left and right, and then stealing their mounts, breaking down barricades, and then infiltrating enemy camps as if we're Indiana Jones. I mean, where's my hat and whip at this point? And then we find our way into this dark room, where this guy comes out of nowhere, commits major animal abuse, and then we wipe the floor with him before he goes running away, and then sets the entire place on fire. And now we have to find a way to escape this raging inferno before it burns down. All of this, and we haven't even gotten into the dungeon yet? Incredible! Now, the dungeon introduces us to a Poe right before heading into the dungeon, ensuring that we know exactly what to do and how to kill them. And then, we descend into the dark abyss, where we come to a narrow corridor with the sounds of dark growling and ceremonial drum beats. And as we descend further, we find these terrifying face eaters that'll pop out of the sand at random to attack you. Not only that, but we have sand that'll swallow you whole. And then I'm not gonna lie, even though these guys definitely fit the dungeon atmosphere, yeah, they're just adorable. They're just cute, okay? Now heading deeper into the dungeon, we find a key to the right of us, and then these beetles come crawling out of nowhere with one mission, and that's you. Now all they do is slow you down, but when you're trying to maneuver through sand, yeah, that's not a good thing. However, they did give you lantern oil before this, which is a hint that maybe fire is a way to keep them at bay. And man, I love this visual right here. It reminds me of that scene from The Mummy where that guy with the torch is getting surrounded by all of those beetles. Now the next room we go into is pretty dark, and you get surrounded by an army of these tiny skeletons, which make them a lot more threatening. Okay, well, kind of. It reminds me of a movie where the main characters fall into a trap and then they gotta escape this army of evil skeletons, you know? Now, the next room is where a lot of people say they ripped off the Forest Temple, which I can understand and agree with, but I think they implemented it pretty well, so I'm not gonna hold it against them. And then we fight our very first Poe, which what you should be expecting at this point is what you saw at the beginning of the dungeon. However, these Poes have been drinking their milk and are much bigger than the normal Poes that we usually face. Now, a funny story is whenever you beat them, you're supposed to get their scent, but whenever I was young, I was I think 10 years old at the time, I didn't want to pick up this scent because I was terrified of losing Ilia's scent, which means I went through the entire dungeon on hard mode. Now, the YouTube channel Game Maker's Toolkit made a video on the dungeons in Twilight Princess where they noticed that at the beginning of the dungeons, you go into a center room. You then go to the right, after getting what you need, you double back to the left, get what you need there, and then you head back to the center room before heading straight up. And because I know that pattern after watching the video, I kind of expected this next part of the dungeon to be pretty boring for me. But that's not actually what I found to be the case at all. For example, when you walk into the right room, you notice this locked door, then you turn around and you see this indention on the floor. And then after that, you notice a slidable wall that's right in front of it. Alright, now we'll take note of that. Then after finding the room beneath you, you turn this turny thing right here, and then you find your very first Redead. I mean, let me just take a quick second to say that I absolutely love the redesign of these monsters right here. I mean, the fact that the Redeads are now mummies that scream to stun you, and then they swing a gigantic buster sword, that's so much cooler than just necking you know? After we get the key that's behind him, if we have good spatial awareness, we'll remember that indention from earlier. And if we look up, we see a hookshot spot now where we can get to. Hookshotting up there, we'll see that the wall is now moved, and we can finally get to our next Poe. However, the Poe that really had me stuck as a kid was the one right over here, because you walk in this narrow hallway, you go through and kill all these enemies, which, let's be real, are only there to distract you until you see this perfectly lit door drawing you to it, hoping to trick you into ignoring the sand pit over here, which will open the door to the Poe that's right behind it. And I know, if you're using the sense mechanic, it's actually pretty simple. But as a kid, I never picked up the Poe's Sin, so this took me quite a long time to find whenever I first played it. Now, speaking of fun little tricks, I really like this one here, where you walk into this well-lit room, you hop down to get the key, and then the lights go out. You head over to try to get to the door, but then all of a sudden you see a bunch of dust on the floor move, and you have no idea what's going on. You can't move that quickly, so you struggle your way up and try to jump the gap, but nothing. You fall to the floor immediately. Now, obviously something isn't right here. The fact you can't move is weird, so you transfer into your wolf form, and then you see Midna, which is losing her mind, as if something's on you. And the solution here is pretty fun. You use the sense mechanic and you see a bunch of rats on you. You use the spin attack to get them off and take them all out before you head out and go on your merry way. Now on the left side of the dungeon, we run into this room where it seems basically pretty empty.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Yep, it was a Stalfo. And I know most people probably saw this, but some people might not notice it as it does blend in quite well with its new redesign to the theme and atmosphere of the dungeon. Now after we take it out with classic swordplay, it falls and you think it's over. But nope, it gets right back up. And the chests in the room give you bombs, hinting that you might need to blow up the bones after you defeat it, which is a really cool twist on a classic enemy. But what's even cooler is that you can actually equip the bomb arrow and one-shot it, which is hella fun and also just makes a lot of sense thematically. Now going further through the dungeon, we make our way through a maze, a gauntlet of re-deads, Stalfos, and these freaking beetles. And then we make our way to the mini-boss, which may just be my favorite mini-boss in the entire series when it comes to the lore and feel of it. I mean, you walk into this abandoned room with the lone sword and these ropes tying it to the floor in the center of a circle that is littered with symbols, and you know, I just can't imagine anyone walking in and thinking, you know what, I bet these are a bunch of religious talismans sealing away a demon, and I should definitely break them. But that's exactly what I do because I have plot armor. And what's the worst that can happen? And look, this enemy is actually pretty generic, but it's still pretty fun, as it's one of the first bosses that you have to switch between your wolf and human form to be able to defeat it. And this leads to one of my favorite items in the entire Zelda franchise, the spinner. By far the most original idea for an item the Zelda team has ever came up with. It's just a real shame that it doesn't get much use outside of the dungeon. Now the room that really does take advantage of this item is the one where you jump around this big room going side to side to avoid the spiky spinning traps that are also on those walls. And look, this is definitely because of the spinner item, but this probably is my favorite Zelda dungeon room of any Zelda dungeon ever. Comment down below if you think any differently, but I really think this might be it. And finally, we're at the boss fight, which thematically is an incredibly themed boss, but realistically is actually one of the most fun boss fights in the entire Zelda franchise. To fight Star-Lord, you ride around the stadium and hop off when you see an opening to take out part of his spine. And as you continue through the fight, these dead soldiers will pop up in order to protect him, which will stay unless you attack them with the spinner at the correct time, and bumping into them will send you right back up to the top where you continue to search for an opening. And when we hit his spine 3 times, we move on to part 2 of the boss fight. This is where we ride up the walls chasing the boss as it shoots energy balls at us, and you have to avoid them by jumping from one wall to the other, and you have to be careful because as you jump, you may actually hit the wall and fall back to an even further level as you did before. And as we get further into this part of the boss fight, there are these spiky spinners that will actually start to get in your way, forcing you to jump a little bit earlier, and if you're not careful, you can run into them, take damage, fall all the way to the bottom, and then we'll have to start over again. And after doing it 3 times, we take out the boss, finally beating the Arbiter's Grounds. Now let's get into the scoring. We'll start with the enemies first. First we have the Bulbins and King Bulbin, which are pretty interesting. And as we get further to the dungeon, we get the Face Eaters, the Mini Stalfos, and the Beetles, which are all new to the series and specifically made for this dungeon, which I absolutely love. The returning enemies like Bubbles and Flame Bubbles fit the dungeon atmosphere perfectly as they're just flying skeleton heads, which can really give you the idea of maybe it being an old inmate that died here. The new twist that they put on the classic enemies like Re-Dead, swinging swords, and the bombs being the weakness for Stalfos was a really good idea. I think they implemented it very well. And the special poses of the dungeons were a pretty good fit. The mini boss of the dungeon was very well done. I really enjoyed how they implemented the switching between both human and wolf form. And y'all know how much I love the boss fight for this dungeon. It's actually my favorite boss fight throughout the entire Zelda franchise, so it should come as no surprise that this dungeon is going to get a 10 out of 10 here for enemies. Now for the puzzles, on the other hand, it definitely wasn't the best by any means. I mean, nothing mind-bending like some of the other ones in the franchise that are just iconic, but all in all, some pretty good puzzles as the ones I listed earlier. Though there was one that really deeply frustrated me, where you walk into this room and you have to light these torches in a certain order, and the only real hint I could think of it being is you gotta light the torch that's on the farthest side closest to the actual secret door, which isn't actually a secret since it's on the map, which makes it a pretty bad puzzle, unless I'm missing something here. But overall, for puzzles, I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. Pretty solid job. And next we're gonna cover Fun Factor, as it's a pretty quick category. The dungeon overall was pretty tricky, which made it pretty entertaining. That alone would get it about a 7 or 8, but the fact that it had not only the funnest boss fight in the game, but also had one of the funnest rooms in the entire Zelda franchise. I mean, what other dungeon makes you feel like you're playing Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 halfway through? I mean, this is a no-brainer. It's getting a 10 out of 10 for the fun factor. And what is there to say for the atmosphere? The theming of the dungeon just starts before you even hit the desert, and the feel of adventure is there throughout the entire gameplay. The atmosphere absolutely blew me away for this dungeon. And look, it might just be because Breath of the Wild was heavily lacking atmosphere in their dungeons. Without a doubt, perfect score for the atmosphere. And so, before we get to the final score, I'm not gonna lie, I had an idea of what score I would give it, that being around a 35 or 36 for the dungeon, and that's because I wanted to pick a dungeon that was pretty darn good for my very first one, and around the A mark. But yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I haven't played Twilight Princess in quite a long time, so I didn't remember this dungeon very well. And so this score comes as a bit of a shock to me as well. The Arbiter's Ground sits at an S rank with a score of 39, a near perfect score. And no, that's not wrong. I didn't do my math wrong. We got a 10 for the enemies, an 8 for the puzzles, a 10 for the fun factor, and an 11 for the atmosphere. There are quite a few dungeons that I believe have a 10 out of 10 atmosphere, but even those don't come quite close to this one. I mean, heck, the enemies themselves feel like they were made specifically for this dungeon. And even in older temples with Stalfos, Skulltulas, and Wallmasters, they never felt like they were specifically themed to fit the atmosphere of the dungeon. And these enemies definitely were. Seriously, the greatest dungeon atmosphere of any dungeon to date. And you know what? This is going to be a very tough one to beat. But who knows? From the vote in my community post, the Forest Temple is up next, so we'll see how well that does in the next installment of the series. But as I release this video, I'll have another post for you guys to vote on which one you want to see after that one, and make sure to vote to see which one you want to see. Like and subscribe to show me that you guys want more of this series, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.